Good morning, Europe. Welcome to our live session. I am Mike Truter, and today I'll be moderating our special What if ISO 20022 went live today? Live events for Europe and the Americas. Today is the 22nd of November 2021, the day when banks worldwide should have been receiving their first high value payment messages in the ISO 20022 format from SWIFT or Target 2. But as we all know, in March 2020, SWIFT pushed back the migration deadline by 1 year. So on this special day, we've organized 3 breakfast conversations with some very special guests to explore the consequences of this delay for banks and market infrastructures. Earlier today, we had a great conversation in Asia with Heng Hai Lim, who represents Singapore on the ISO 20022 Registration Management Group. If you missed it because you were sleeping, have no fear. You can always find the recording on our YouTube channel and on our website. So moving forward, though, joining us for our European breakfast session is Nasir Ahmed, head of ISO program at SWIFT, so a key character in this migration story. Also with us is Red Compass Labs head of payment strategy, Julie Getter. Welcome to you both. Now I'm itching to get into our conversation today, so let's dive straight in. Maybe Nasir, I can start with you. In March 2020, SWIFT announced a delay of a year. If you had the superpower to turn back time, knowing what you know now, would SWIFT still take the same decision again?
Thanks, Mike. Firstly, just wanted to say it's a real pleasure for me to be here to talk about a topic that clearly is quite important to all of us, and it's right at the forefront of our minds. But sort of back to your question, I'm sure there's a lot of things that I can think about doing with that superpower, but I don't think changing that particular decision would be one of them. And really, the reasons are twofold, right? So I think it goes without saying that the move to ISO 2022 isn't just a change in messaging syntax, and it's not just a mandatory change that's coming for the industry, right? We think, and I think everybody agrees, that it represents a real sort of foundation for the future of payments in terms of instant and frictionless transactions. So at that time, I think the banks sort of recognized this point and made it clear that they needed a little bit more time to think a bit more deeply about their strategic plans to adopt ISO 20022 natively in their back offices so that they could really leverage the true value of the standard. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is going to be fully ISO 20022 native because of this delay from day one, but the extra time I think has certainly helped with participants being able to plan a little bit better. I think, secondly, what I'd like to say here is we at Swift needed to pair this migration with a more fundamental change in the industry to address some of the frictions that we've been seeing in correspondent banking today. So the extra time really has enabled us to go live at the same time as the ISO 20022 migration date with a real sort of evolution, right, of the Swift platform towards this principle of transaction management. So we think like this new dynamic would really allow us to sort of maintain transaction data integrity, like end to end in the transaction chain, but also sort of bring in some mutualized value added services. So we think the rich data plus these new enhanced capabilities is a much more compelling solution to the frictions that we see in payments today. But just one last point to close off as well. I think we would be remiss not to mention this, but with the benefit of hindsight, we now know the sort of huge economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic as well, which wasn't apparent at that time in March 2020. But what we've seen is that economic impact has impacted budgeting, planning, etc. So the 1 year delay certainly has helped in hindsight from that perspective as well.
Fantastic, great answer. Julie, coming to you now, what have you seen in the industry? Do you agree that the time has been used wisely by banks and the broader financial services industry to kind of get themselves ready? Is
I
that what's happened?
I think for me, like that was more of a release for everyone because everyone was so busy on, as Nasir mentioned, like trying to survive COVID. All in all, that I think what realistically happened is like the delay meant that higher chance of being on time
Mm-hmm.
for a year later, and actually also like in a safer way as well. Because I think at the beginning, like Think of, let's go back, at the beginning of when the migration was announced and so on. So you were in the middle of a pandemic. You were not sure about like what sort of fallback plan you had in place and so on. I think now like we see a lot more clarity, so it's easier for the bank to plan. And like as Natia just mentioned, I think there is a lot of sort of contingency plan put in place by Swift to be in the position where the banks can actually like be ready on time. So I do think that actually, that was a sight with relief from anyone, and that people could not really start planning really efficiently at first.
Okay, yeah. So I think Nessie, also you've gone through kind of your agreement is completely aligned with Julie's. I'm taking it, but maybe I can ask a little bit more of a contentious question. Obviously, made a good decision last year. That's clear. Definitely, as you say, COVID and so on's kind of backed that up. Actually, it was a wise decision even before we understood the complete consequence of COVID. But is there any chance Swift could announce any further delays, or are you going to stick with your revised plan this time? It's locked in, and now we need to move forward.
So I think that'll be a quick one, Mike. I think at this point, there are no plans to introduce any further delays to the process. So as things stand, I think we're good to go.
Great. I mean that's good. Some certainty, I think, is important as well, right? Now it really is real, and banks understand what they need to do. Definitely. But we talk a lot about banks being ready, but maybe I have a question for both of you. What about corporates? Is there not a lot for companies to prepare for as well? And what does that impact look like for corporates?
Yeah, I'll go first on that one if you don't mind. But so I think the challenge really stems down to, again, the readiness of the banks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know you're talking about corporates here, but the reason why I mention banks is because there's some things that need to be done at the bank level for that value to trickle down to the corporates, right? And one of the decisions that banks really need to make is, firstly, how are they going to be able to collect the richer data from their corporate customers, from their customer channels,
Mm-hmm.
but also how are they going to expose that richer data to their underlying corporate customers through their customer channels as well, right? So there needs to be incorporated into the wider plan that banks are implementing a clear vision of how do you really leverage the value of ISO 20022 to expose new services, benefits, enriched data, etc., to the corporate customers, right? So that's one element of it, and I think that's going to be a journey, right? That is fundamentally quite a big shift in terms of resource investment, etc., to develop those functionalities. Then you have the corporate side of the equation where they need to be ready to do something with that. But I think 2 points here. I mean, corporates, or at least some corporates, have some understanding of what ISO 20022 is through the PAIN messages that are used currently today.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, really their readiness would depend on how easy their banks can make for them in order to be able to take that information and do something with it. So ultimately, it really comes down to how the banking community is going to implement this. I think if we go the right route and the right strategy, the benefits will accrue for the corporate customer base as well.
Yeah, I think for me, like what I see is like all in all a bit of a mixed bag, which depends on like, the two sides of the coin, as Nastia mentioned. So first, what is the strategy from the bank? Are they going ISO native or using some translation services? Obviously, if they are going ISO native, this is really where the corporate can grab the benefits from the ISO migration. And then on the corporate side, I think we see the same mixed bags as well, right? With basically like corporates being very, very, very keen to get to the ISO 20022 standards, and were actually disappointed when the delay was announced because they were counting on this to increase the efficiency of some of their processes, such as reconciliation, and stop spending crazy amount of money in account virtualization, or liquidity management, moving to predictive liquidity management, a bit more as in reactive and so on. So yeah, like I said, I think it's very much a mixed bag. Glad to hear that Swift is not going to announce a further delay for the corporate. And I think, earlier you asked the superpower question and going back in time. I think, probably if we could go back in time, one thing that many banks should do is actually tackling more the education point of the corporate, because I think there's been a lot of focus on operation, but not so much on corporate, and I think it will hit hard down the line.
I think that's an interesting point, Julie. You know, a lot of banks, when we speak about ISO 20022, really focus on the kind of back end integration pieces, right? But there's not a lot of talk, and I like the way Nasir mentioned, that they can really focus on the channel side. This is a point where banks can differentiate their services and really leverage and bring something new to market, potentially finding new opportunities for revenue, which is always useful, especially for an expensive change like this. But maybe, Nasir, looking to the future, what are the key areas where banks must still focus to really ensure they're ready on time? Where's the kind of key areas that they must keep in their sights if they're going to make this transition successful?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to note here is when it comes to the Swift migration, then I think we are doing things to attempt to provide a certain level of interoperability to make things easier for the community, right? So things like central translation from MX to MT, and also sort of saving the rich data centrally in what we are calling the transaction manager, a new component that we will be releasing at the same time as the ISO migration date to solve some of the truncation issues. So hopefully that will make things easier. But as I said earlier, banks really need to be working towards becoming ISO 20022 native. Plus, there are market infrastructures that are migrating to ISO 20022 around the same time. So that adds to the complexity. So I think that brings a couple of challenges that people need to be looking at, right? So in terms of the things that people need to be thinking about. So firstly, this is a really complex project, right? So a lot of banks, especially the ones who have global presence, etc., will have several moving parts. So it's a complex, resource-heavy transformation, which requires a sort of complete change in how the back office architecture works. So it'll be difficult when people are trying to prioritize competing priorities within the bank. That's a challenge. I think the other thing people really need to think about is potentially some harmonization issues, particularly in the start. Because what we're doing at Swift and some market infrastructure migrations in terms of timing are not completely matching up, right? So for example, the CHAPS migration dates are not completely in line with ours. And that represents a little bit of a data truncation challenge for some direct participants for a short period of time. So people need to think about that initial couple of months where that might be a potential issue. But most importantly, I think you mentioned this before, is making sure processes, but also employees of the banks are up to speed with the new standard, right? So training is going to be key. But also, when I talk about processes, and as an example, calibrating your screening engines to more efficiently use the richer data in ISO messages. So I certainly think there'll be an initial period with some teething issues, but we can counter that with sort of increasing the learning more about ISO now and testing robustly. Like that will really help the community. So those are the things that I would say we really need to keep in focus as we move towards the date.
Fantastic points. Unfortunately, we're out of time already. So on that final piece of advice from Nasir, thank you, Nasir and Julie, both for your insights, and thank you to our audience as well for joining this conversation today. It's a fascinating discussion. We've got 12 more months, but that 12 months is going to be extremely busy for the industry, and we've got a lot of great pointers today on the key areas that we really need to focus forward on. And don't forget, we'll have one more live session coming up, a North American breakfast chat with Kelly Johnson from the National Bank of Canada at 3 p.m. GMT, or that's 10 a.m. EST. As always, if you need support with your ISO 20022 migration, please feel free to check out our videos on this topic on YouTube, visit our website, or just reach out to us directly at Red Compass Labs. We'd be happy to talk. That's it for now. See you later today for our final session of the day.